Thank you very much. Friends and guests. Wow. Thank you. Hi. Hey, everybody. I'm Brian Radburn. I'm the Vice President of Corporate Operations and the CFO here at Science World. Welcome. Welcome to Science World. I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. Moreover, we're thrilled to gather tonight and launch a speaker series in partnership with the Pacific Water Research Center at Faculty of Environment, Simon Fraser University. This series, To Catch a Falling Sky, embodies the very essence of our mandate to hold convenings such as this around difficult and sometimes controversial topics at the intersection of science and society. There's a need, perhaps more so than ever, to encourage evidence and science-based discourse and to foster critical thinking to counter the rise in what I'm going to refer to as strategic ignorance and information aversion. Folks, Science World's vision is within a generation, Canada will be a country of thriving, sustainable communities rooted in science, innovation, and a deep connection to nature. We can achieve this vision by creating and delivering inspiring and memorable connections to STEAM and convening with a valued community partner like we are this evening. I want to thank the Pacific Water Research Center and the Faculty of Environment, Simon Fraser University, for being such a terrific community partner and for assembling this gathering on what I feel is a very important topic. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor ZAFAR ADEEL, who will set the stage for this evening. Professor.
Thank you very much, Brian. A very warm welcome to everyone on behalf of Simon Fraser University and Pacific Water Research Center. It's great to see such a wonderful crowd here. The timing and the topic of this discussion, I think, is very important. As we see this increasing polarization around issues of energy usage, climate change, water security, I think the time is right to have a conversation which is based on evidence and based on scientific knowledge. And we also wanted to create a space which is open for all kinds of perspectives. And we're very grateful to Science World for giving us this opportunity to be part of this, this exercise. The Pacific Water Research Center is a think tank that sits inside the Faculty of Environment, and our focus is to serve as a bridge between the scientific and the research community and the policy audiences. And it's a bridge that runs both ways. So we pick up existing science and translate it into usable policy recommendations, and we go the other way. We pick up the burgeoning science question, policy questions, and have some of the colleagues who work with us to respond to those policy questions based on science and evidence. So, like I said, the topic is really interesting. We deliberately chose a provocative title, To Catch a Falling Sky, because you always are hearing in media that, oh, the sky is falling, you know, the earth is going to melt and things are going to go really bad, which they probably would if you don't do something to fix the situation. And that's what this is all about, to create the space where we discuss those kind of solutions based on evidence and scientific knowledge. And that's why it's very important for you to be part of this dialogue. And I'll trust my colleague Andy Wright to make sure that we get that engagement. Before I pass on the mic to Andy, let me introduce him as well. Dr. Andy Wright is an adjunct professor at the Pacific Water Research Center. He's an entrepreneur, he's a philanthropist, and more than other things, he's also a very dedicated researcher. So he's working with our center to precisely find the answers to these kind of questions. So the discussion we're having tonight is going to feed into directly the work he does. So please join me in welcoming Andy.
I think ADEEL left a very important point off there. I'm also an agitator and a catalyst and a whole bunch of other words. We should have a clicker up here on the stage. Kelsey. Oh, there you go. Thank you. And you push which button? Top one? Thank you. We should have figured that out earlier. So, To Catch a Falling Sky is a pretty poetic kind of title, but it's has a real basis. ADEEL spoke to sort of the broad scale motivation, but it was really motivated. The title came from a personal experience with a close friend of mine. My friend Ron Jensen is a general contractor, and he was driving his daughter to school, and his daughter and my daughters are friends, and they were about 12 at the time. And on the radio was a story, an interview on CBC in the morning, where and I'll use the word environmental zealot, was talking about how the end of the world is nigh and the sky is falling. And this poor young kid got out of the school, Rieva, got out of the truck to go to school that day in absolute tears, and said to her dad, why do I bother, Dad? There's no point. And I was heartbroken when Ron told me that story. Ron and I get into a lot of trouble together, for the record. But I was heartbroken because when I grew up, and my daughters feel the same thing, but that was a really poignant moment. I was heartbroken because I don't know about you, but I grew up in a glorious time. When I was 12, all I worried about is how the heck I was going to get down the fishing pond and catch the mackerel off the ocean and play in the dirt. Kids should be growing up not at the age of 12, worrying about the end of the world. And so that is the motivation for this series. We're going to catch the sky because there are great solutions and there is a positive way forward. And so we hope to engender this conversation around a hopeful transition where hope is truly grounded in reality, not grounded in a hopeful strategy that a wish card might come to fall. We can control our future. We just need to get on with it. And so this discussion series is to engender that change. So I ask you to join me in that. And tonight's title is a climate of change. Not climate change, but a climate of change. How can we in our society engender this change for positive solutions? And so we have three speakers tonight. I am super proud of the fact that Honourable Minister George Heyman has joined us tonight, followed by Tim Barton from the City of Vancouver, who's going to focus on one immediate solution that we can affect in the next 10 years. And then we have to discuss decarbonisation, as the policy wonks refer to it, or negative emissions, and Jens is going to be talking to the other end of the spectrum. Rather than trying to hit everything tonight, we're going to get George to talk about the sort of the framework of what the future could hold, and then we're going to illuminate two spots in that future. So we start with, I'm an engineer, and I'd like to think of myself as a bit of a photographer and a storyteller, but I've got really no skills. But in this script that I'm trying to write for the movies, it's like Apollo 13, except it's like, Houston, you've got the problem, guys. And this is what the problem looks like. So you're familiar with these. You've probably been over-familiar with these kind of pictures coming out of the IPCC. Those are the white graphs where it's all up and left, and it's basically up to the right, rather. It's going to get hot. And when it gets hot, we have problems. And we've heard more than enough about that to know that we need to get going on it. So this chart, with the pie charts, they're simply representations of what our emissions look like. So today, Canada has a bubble about so big that it's 750 megatons. And if we do a business as usual into the future, by 2050, it's going to be 1,000 megatons per annum. And the IPCC have just told us by 2050, we've pretty much got to get to zero and then be negative emissions thereafter if we've got a chance of doing things well. The exciting thing is we really do have a great shot at doing it. What we have to choose as a collective, as a society, is get on with the job, and B, start agreeing on how we're going to get on with the job. So here we go. How do we get down that chart? And today, the answer is right in front of you. It's buried in this pie chart. But each and every one of us can play a major role, because transportation, home heating, and electricity almost take up 50% of our emissions. And it's perhaps over 50% when you look at the oil and gas sector and you say to yourself, well, if I don't burn oil and gas, they don't have to produce oil and gas, if I don't produce as much, that pie will shrink up too, which is indeed true. So if you commit to, in the next decade, buying an electric car, or moving your mode of transportation to cycling, transit, or an electrified means, or when your gas furnace at home dies, commit to moving to a heat pump, lo and behold, we can solve half of the problem right out the gate by just choosing to do so. So don't wait for your government to tell you what to do. We can get on with it as a collective. There's a Kennedy reference in there. I can see George smiling. So this is what our emission profile looks today. And we played this game on the Slido with asking you the question. If we're going to tackle that 50% emissions, and we did it the simple way of literally plugging into electric cars all in, and using electric resistance heating to change all our heating modes. How many Site Cs, how many square kilometers of solar PV would we need to do it? Well, the answer is a heck of a big number, and it's a scary number. But if we get really, really smart, we don't need to do that. Electrical resistance heating, you can immediately downsize to heat pumps, which is a fifth of the power consumption of resistance heating. And if you retrofit or build a new home that's fully insulated, you can come down by another factor of half again. So there's a lot we can do to minimize that. And so if we choose to take those options, and if we choose to take the options around great transit and electric cars and ride sharing and all the schemes that you're beginning to hear emerging, we can very quickly reduce that number to a really small number of new infrastructures, power infrastructure requirements. So from my perspective, it's exciting because we can get on and we can do stuff. So the federal government recently published an 80-page document about how to transition our economy, and embedded in it with these 5 points. And I actually thought they were pretty good points, because if we, in principle, adopt them, they give us the language by which we can start discussing as a community how we solve our solutions. And the BC NDP government recently did a similar exercise, but they put 4 discussion documents out, which echoed many of the solutions that I've just referenced, but echoed it through, in my mind, these principles. So I thought it was great. And so I'm going to invite the speakers to the table to talk about this evening. And the framework is George, and I'm going to refer to George as George, because George and I have had a great friendship for 10 years. I'm deeply honoured that he's here tonight, and deeply honoured to call him a friend. We spar on many issues, and but they're always great discussions and always of great intellectual debate. And I privilege any time that I get to spend with George. So thank you for joining us tonight, George. And then Tim and Jens are going to follow up with these solution-specific points. So let's welcome up George. As I said, you can read George's illustrious career here, but the reality is I am deeply honored to call George a friend. I have tripped over many politicians in my life, and he is one of the few people that I can say integrity is his middle name, and I am proud to call him and welcome a friend and welcome him to stage. George, come on up.
Thanks, Andy. I think about 20 minutes ago I was landing in the helijet, so bear with me for a minute or so while I try to lay out the papers that I'm going to largely ignore and take a look at my watch so I don't go longer than I meant to, despite the fact that I was invited to speak for a length of time that is far longer than I think anybody wants to listen to me. I'd much rather leave some time for questions, and I think the questions that we'll be answering, and discussing will be far more illuminating than the question period I have to sit through 4 days a week in Victoria. Andy Max is actually my middle name. Thank you for the warm introduction, and Andy's right. We've sparred over the years, and I recall, I'm going to embarrass you now a bit, about 7 or 8 years ago when I was executive director of Sierra Club, Andy said to me, why are you spending all this time talking about climate? I just want to protect the grizzly bears in the Great Bear Rainforest. And I remember saying, there's not a lack of connection here, Andy. It is, in fact, connected. And I may, or Jens may, who spent a lot of time working on preserving the Great Bear Rainforest for all of its ecosystem values, not the least of which is storage of carbon. Knows the depth of I could use the word compromise, but it's got a negative connotation, so I'd just rather say discussion of interests and finding a way to accommodate in a positive way the interests of Indigenous people, the interests of environmentalists, and the interests of people who wanted to protect old-growth forest, do something about climate, as well as the interests of forest companies to make some money and provide some jobs for people in the region in a way that was ecologically sustainable. I'm going to go back a minute to the opening premise of the forum tonight. It would be quite forgivable for everybody to, especially if you were following the mainstream media news coverage of the IPCC report, to simply believe that the sky is falling, and it may be. Certainly I'm not meaning to diminish the importance of the report or the importance of the cataclysm that we are facing if we do nothing in terms of heeding the report or taking the lessons of the report. But I also know, and this also goes back to my days at Sierra Club and discussing with a friendly pollster who did work for the environmental movement and cares very deeply about environmental issues and climate change, who said to us after showing us a slideshow, if you want people to do nothing about climate change and simply turn on their television and just watch whatever is happening on the latest comedy, tell them the world is ending, because they can't cope with that. Most people can't cope with that or believe or see themselves as having a role to play in doing something about it. And as much as I think it's important for all of us as aware, ecologically aware people and politicians who have a particular role of responsibility to not let people forget that we have a deepening crisis. I think if we want to talk about engaging people, we have to talk about what gives them hope for what will life be like if we do the kinds of things we need to do to address the challenge of climate change, the crisis of climate change, and the horror. I don't mind saying it in this room, you're here for a reason. The horror if we do nothing. The horror for species, the horror for Indigenous people, the horror for our children and our grandchildren, and the horror for the planet. But the report itself, the IPCC said a viable pathway to keep warming below 1.5 degrees centigrade is still open to us, and went on to say, if I can actually read my cramped writing here, that limiting temperature increase requires unprecedented changes in society, but will have huge benefits. So what I and my colleagues in government are trying to do as we work toward creating what we're calling a climate change strategy, what we've called at times a clean growth strategy, and which we'll give a final name sometime over the next 4 weeks before we actually share it with British Columbians, is try to describe what we're trying to address, as well as trying to describe what the future looks like in order to meet the targets we legislated last spring, and what it looks like in a whole number of areas, a whole series of things that we can do over the next 12 years to meet our first target in 2030 of a 40% reduction below 2007 levels. I swear I have different numbers. The federal government uses different numbers, but I believe I'm remembering that right. And we will do that. We will show what we intend to do in terms of buildings and homes, in terms of transportation, in terms of industry, in terms of electrification, and what we expect to see as concrete emission reductions over a 12-year period. And we'll also identify, areas where we believe if we take some more action, that we will outline in specific areas, but we haven't yet had a chance to model. So the numbers we will use will be based on the best economic modeling and emission modeling to which we have access, and the rest we will do over the next 18 months or so. But we want to show British Columbians not just what we can do if we're serious about addressing climate change, and that we're committed to spending the money to address the issues. We also want to show what does it look like to have access to better transit? What does it look like to have access to clean energy vehicles, not just in the Lower Mainland, but throughout British Columbia? What does it look like if a government provides the incentives for automobile suppliers to have to meet a target for a certain percentage of clean energy vehicles by a certain date, and therefore increase the supply, choice, and availability for British Columbians, while at the same time we continue to provide support for families to purchase these vehicles until such time as the price is pretty much equal to what people are paying now. And the auto industry says that's sometime in the mid-2020s. That's not very long from now. What does it look like if we find a way to give incentives to people, or perhaps even more than incentives to people, to make it possible for people to make their homes more energy efficient? Andy talked about heat pumps. The Netherlands has recently developed a whole program to essentially put an envelope around existing buildings that brought them very close to passive house standards. And the more you train people to do this kind of work, the more you get builders and contractors used to doing this kind of work, the more you bring down the cost of doing it. But the advantages are huge. People are more comfortable. Who doesn't want to be more comfortable? People are healthier. Anybody who gets a flu or a cold in the winter would love to be in a more healthful building. Energy costs for families are cheaper, and therefore more affordable. I think one of the keys for people who are struggling to, we live in Vancouver, I assume most of us, so I don't really have to talk about the tremendous problem with affordability of housing that ripples through everything else. What does it mean for people if we can show people how they can participate with their community, with government, in making the kinds of changes we want to make to take action against increasing climate change, while at the same time being more comfortable and benefiting from it, and while at the same time building a healthier economy, a more diverse economy in which there are more jobs and more skills for people to learn to fill those jobs, an economy in which we don't depend on giving handouts or income supports to people. Instead, we find ways to train people to give them a chance to be economically engaged. What does it mean to use the power of government to model the kinds of changes we want to see? So I asked myself that question after I was elected, because we do have tremendous resources in government. We also build a lot of stuff. We have the ability to provide electrical clean energy. We can support renewable energy. We can build on the advantage that we've had from having mostly clean power from hydro for many, many years. We can use the resources of the state to build charging infrastructure, for instance, for electric cars or hydrogen, for hydrogen-powered vehicles, so that people no longer think it's going to be a problem to get from A to B. But more importantly, we build a lot of buildings. We build schools, we build hospitals, and when we do that, we not only support the economy, we also can develop skills for contractors and tradespeople to learn how to do things more energy efficiently. So I wanted us as government to look at what it would mean to build our new buildings that had not yet been designed and planned and were well down the pipeline to passive house standards. So we decided we would find out what the what the net present value of doing that would mean. In other words, what would it really cost government in additional expenditure to build a net zero school, for instance. And the first model we got back fairly recently was it would add about between 0.5 and 0.75% to the cost, but more importantly, that expenditure by very, very conservative modeling would be paid back in about half the useful life of the building. So it doesn't make sense not to do it. These are the kinds of stories we can share with people who are worried about government spending too much or taxing too much. We can share the kinds of stories about how we can create better and more diverse jobs while at the same time helping the planet instead of hurting it. We can create stories about how driving a clean energy vehicle isn't a niche. It's actually making life more affordable, and we're taking a number of steps early to get us to the point 5 to 10 years from now where it's absolutely just as economical to get into a clean energy vehicle as anything else, that you'll be able to power and charge it, you'll be able to get from A to B, and guess what? You'll save a lot of money while you're doing it. I think people in British Columbia, and we've done some focus groups on this, if we ask people what do they think of when they think about the environment, they actually think about their own interaction with a park, with the ocean, with orcas that they may have been fortunate enough to see. It's very personal. And people react strongly. They don't react so strongly to the word climate. They react strongly to the word clean. People want to live in a clean environment and a clean community. They want their kids to experience the same beauty that we've had a chance to experience. So for me, I want us to have verifiable methods of meeting the targets that I had the privilege of legislating last spring. So I look forward at the end of November or December to actually bringing in a detailed plan of how we were going to do that. And the detailed plan will be important for people like me, for people like you in this hall to believe that we're serious and credible. For most of our neighbors, people will want to know that we're doing the right thing, that we're protecting the future for their kids and grandkids, and that we're going to make life better for them, not worse. And we're going to find ways to partner with them. People want to believe that government will be their partner, not a body that's somehow controlling their life, but a group of people who are looking for ways to work with them to help people do what they intrinsically want to do, and that's make a positive difference, but do it in a way that allows them to be comfortable, to take care of their children, to have a good place to live, to buy those things their kids want, to learn how to skate, to learn how to play a musical instrument, or any of the things that are normal and hopefully increasingly normal for those families that don't have access to those. So I'm going to close because I want to hear from other people. I've pretty much completely ignored my notes here. I want to close by just reflecting on, as minister, I went to the Conference of the Parties, the UN Climate Conference in Bonn last year, and the two things that struck me the most and that I've never forgotten were A, the tremendous impact on Indigenous people and Indigenous people from Canada, from across Canada, from the Arctic. The territory spoke about this. Indigenous people from low-lying island nations in the southern hemisphere talked about this and said, we're on the front lines. And unlike people who are descended from Europeans who basically traversed the world and settled in other places after they'd effectively despoiled most of their own resources, our whole sense of identity, our culture, our language is rooted in our place. And climate change is not only driving us out of our place, it's totally changing how the place can sustain us. So for me, when I'm talking to people who will understand that and be sympathetic to it, I talk about that because I believe it really informs our responsibility. The other side of it, though, is hope. It's what can we do to change it? And the other lesson I learned, because there was a whole group from the United States there, and their whole message in an era of Donald Trump was the federal government in the United States may not be looking for creative solutions, may not be taking action, but a whole bunch of cities and states, and this was also repeated by small cities or states in Europe who talked about the changes they were making at the local level. So I appreciate what our federal government and federal minister is trying to do. I think we can do a lot at the subnational level, not because British Columbia, with far less than 1% of the world's total emissions, can stop climate change on our own, but because we will never reverse it if we don't do our part. We'll never reverse it if we don't model the positive changes we can bring to our emissions and our communities. And by showing leadership, we encourage others to do the same. So it doesn't just take nations to make a change. It takes cities like Vancouver and provinces like British Columbia. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, George. That was awesome. Tim, could I invite you to the stage? So, I don't know, Tim.
Never met him before in my life. Yeah.
Welcome, Tim. I had the privilege of tripping over Tim about a month ago, notionally, as I was trying to pull together speakers, maybe 6 weeks, speakers, and pull the evening together. And Tim was presenting at another venue. And it was a moment of relief went off because I was struggling to put the evening together. I found my man. So I'm going to bring Tim to the table. Tim, this is Tim.
Thanks, Andy. Afraid you got another British accent to contend with, so bear with me. Hopefully if I push this. Andy? Andy?
Yeah, I'm putting in slides.
Oh, you are putting in my slides. Okay, I do have slides, but I can start without that. So, my name's Tim Barton. I'm a senior transportation planner and engineer at the City of Vancouver. And hopefully I'm going to tell you a hopeful transportation story about what Vancouver's been doing.
Just the right one.
Just the right one. Over the last few years, over the last decades, I guess, and also looking forward as well. So I'm going to go back in time a little bit and tell you where we came from. I'm going to tell you what we are getting up to at the moment, and I'm going to try and give you a little glimpse into the future as well in terms of what hopefully we can expect to come soon. So, first of all, just reminding everyone, and Andy already kind of showed you a version of this pie, but why is transportation so important to consider in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? As you saw earlier on, it makes up about a quarter of greenhouse gases. So that's a pretty significant part of the pie. And then for this region in particular, we have about 1 million new people and about 500,000 new jobs that are due to come here by 2040. So that's a lot more demand for people moving around the region, not just the people that are already here, but all these future people. How we plan and prioritize transportation infrastructure is therefore going to have a big impact on how these people move around, what mode of transportation that they use. Do they get in a car, or can they use transit, or do they walk, and can they bike? And we've heard a lot about going to electric vehicles from gas-powered vehicles. I'm going to suggest that's not the solution. I think it's part of the way, it gets us part of the way there, but I don't think we should think of it as the kind of the ultimate solution that we are looking for, and I'll get to that as we get there as well. So this is actually Vancouver, or it's a Vancouver that could have been. There was a kind of love affair with a car that started post-war, and this could be actually Houston or somewhere else like that, right? That's actually Stanley Park in the background, and this is like an artist's impression of what could have happened in Vancouver. And I think we're all glad that is not what has happened. but it shows that there was definitely a different attitude, and sort of transportation engineers probably had a very different reputation back then than maybe what they do in some more progressive cities now. So we didn't go that way. Which way did we go? I'm going to suggest that 1997 was an important point in Vancouver's history. Not just because I'm like a transportation nerd, but in 1997 we created, or not me, but my predecessors created the transportation plan for 1997. And that was the first time that the city of Vancouver categorically said, we are not going to widen our roads to accommodate more vehicles, and that we're going to prioritize in this order: walking, cycling, transit, goods movement, and then cars. So that was the first time that this kind of modal hierarchy was developed in Vancouver. And in the decade since that plan was launched, it's kind of worked, as you can see on the right-hand side as well. As population went up, as jobs went up, the number of vehicles entering the city actually decreased. And that, I think, has a lot to do with density and land use and how transportation interacts with that. If you remember one thing tonight, it's that land use and transportation are intricately linked. So where are we now? The city's long-range transportation plan is called Transportation 2040, and it, together with some other kind of related plans like the Greener City Action Plan that you may have heard of, Healthy City Strategy, and Renewable City Strategy, they make up the foundation for planning for sustainable transportation in the city of Vancouver. It's jumped ahead. That's amazing. So one of the key targets in Transportation 2040 is this one here. So in 2008, when the metrics for the plan were being developed, we were at about 40% of all trips by more sustainable travel modes. We have an interim target to get to 50% by 2020, and by 2/3 of people traveling by walk, bike, or transit by 2040. We also need a bunch of policies and a bunch of actions to go along with that and to make this a reality. So that's what I'm going to try and speak to now for the next few slides. So as I just said, like one of the key ones is land use. And you may be familiar with the term transit-oriented development, or TODs. That refers to putting a good mix of different types of land uses around transit hubs, such as SkyTrain stations. So like Joyce Collingwood or Marine Gateway would be really good examples in the city of Vancouver, or the entire downtown. Where basically you don't have to get in, you may be able to use transit to get to work, you don't have to use your car, and you may be able to walk to the grocery store and walk to a park, and basically you don't have to get in a car to meet your everyday needs. And of course, if you're not in a car, then you're not contributing towards climate change, and you're far more healthy as well. So there's lots of kind of co-benefits to this as well. So one of the other things was policies around making it easier for people to do that, easy for people to cycle and walk. If you have not been paying attention, I don't know what you've been doing if you live in Vancouver, but we have a lot of bike lanes now that we didn't used to have, and not just painted bike lanes, because I think we found that they are going to have a very marginal impact in terms of changing people's travel behavior, but really well separated bike lanes, so people feel really safe traveling around by bike. We have this kind of 8 to 18 motto, or all ages and abilities. And I have an 8-year-old, so I'm kind of perfectly judged to be able to know, like, do I feel safe for my kid to be on these lanes? So that's a lot of the work we've done, and it's also about creating kind of more pleasant sidewalks as well, right? Or a nice buffer from moving vehicles and things like that. The other kind of action and policy is around transit, and working with TransLink on transit-supportive streets, and this is the project that I'm directly involved with at the moment. So TransLink are working on delivering more B lines, which is kind of sort of rapid bus, as you could call it in other parts of the world, BRT, bus rapid transit, branded B lines here in Vancouver. So there's a new one that is due to start in Vancouver in September 2019, so like a year away from now, on 41st Avenue. So TransLink are doing their bit. They're committing money to increase the frequency, but we own the streets. So we've been working really closely with them to work out how we can make that bus faster and more reliable so that more people want to use it. Because if more people get on the bus, and if that means they stop using their car, then that has all the positive stuff that we want to do. So that means, in this instance, thinking about a lot of bus lanes and bus bulb outs and different changes to intersections to make sure the bus has a good advantage over single occupancy vehicles. So is it working? That's what you want to know. We have those targets. How are we doing? How do you think we're doing? Think we're doing well? We're actually doing pretty well. We're actually at our 50% mode target, like ahead of our 2020 date. So sounds good, but maybe that's the low-hanging fruit, probably, right? It always is. So I think we've still got like a long way to go, and we've still got lots of challenges ahead as we try and get to reach 2/3 by 2040. And 2/3 isn't the end of the story either, I don't think. Like London is setting like, I think it's like 75 or 80%. You know, this target was set back in 2008, 2010, something like that. So I think as we go into the future, I think we're going to see kind of we need to push for more and more. But it's good. It's good. We just don't get complacent. But it gives us hope, right? That's the motto. And the other thing in terms of like outcomes that I just wanted to emphasize was the health outcomes as well. UBC, not SFU, did some work on health outcomes for the Comox Helmlicke Greenway in downtown Vancouver. And they did before and after studies, and they found that more people were getting more people were getting physical activity, and less people were reporting poor days of mental health or physical health, and the bike mode split went up by nearly 50%. So that's like really, really positive, really fantastic outcomes, and we want more of that. We want more of that everywhere. So now looking to the future a little bit, going back to this slide here. So as I said, there's lots more to do. 50% isn't good enough. We know that. We know we need to do more. And we know that we need to move more people, going back to the 1 million more people that are coming, we need to move more people in the same amount of space that we have now. So each person is going to have less space to move around the city. So it's about climate change, it's about health, but it's also about geometry and this spatial relationship as well. So there's a practicality, in terms of space as well. So private vehicles, really inefficient way to move around the city. Expect you knew that already. Buses are better. B-lines with dedicated lanes are great. And SkyTrain is so good that it's literally off the chart. So we need to be moving towards those more efficient modes, right? And to give you kind of an example of what that looks like on a street. So a typical city arterial street currently carries about 20,000 people a day. Maybe there's like 6 lanes, 3 in each direction, and some sidewalks. That's about 20,000 people a day. So we can do a lot better than that in the future. And this is my kind of future street here, without knocking Andy's glasses off. So if you put some dedicated transit lanes on that, and if you put some bike lanes on that, bike lanes actually way more efficient use of space than vehicles in terms of the number of people that it can actually move, even though they're going a shorter distance. So that gets us there. And then the future piece of this, I think, is automated vehicles and automated technology. And by that, I mean kind of automated transit to a large degree as well. And the ability through automation to move more people more efficiently in the same space. That can also apply to general purpose vehicles as well, as we look at sort of automated and connected and electric and shared vehicles in the future. That's our acronym ACES, Automated, Connected, Electric, Shared, if you want an acronym. So they'll be getting more people in the same vehicles, and if they're automated, they can be closer together as well, which kind of increases that efficiency as well. And increases safety as well, which is obviously like a big benefit, I think, from automated vehicles. So that's Vancouver's story so far. Like, I don't think it's a complete story, but there is reason to be optimistic. And I will leave it there for now, and I'm going to look forward to the question period at the end. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Tim. It was awesome. Why I'm getting Jens teed up here, think about the questions you might want to start asking and start feeding them into the Slido application, because then we'll be ready to come straight out the gate with questions when the questions period ticks over. And if there's if there's a question there that is pretty much what you want to ask, then just vote for it, because the idea and the discussion is the important thing. So please take a moment there and give me 30 seconds, Jen. I've got to get your tea done. Come on up, Jens. So I would like to welcome Jens. I've known Jens longer than I've known George, I believe. Is that correct? I think so.
Might be the case.
It might be the case. Yeah. And we've sparred even more than I've sparred with George. This is Jens. You can read all about Jens here. I am deeply grateful to have Jens in my life because Jens always challenges me to my thinking. Jens always puts me right more often than I seem to put Jens right, I think. If we had a scoreboard, I think I'm losing. But we have lots of great coffee debates where Jens keeps me on the straight and narrow. So I'm deeply grateful to have Jens come and talk to us tonight. The other end of the spectrum, Tim just spoke of the things that we can do in the here and now. And he rightly corrects me if you didn't see between the lines in my presentation that I said one of the things you can do here is buy an electric car when your car dies. But to Tim's point, do you even need an electric car if all these transit services and mode sharing and completely different modes of transportation are viable for your life? So perhaps think about that as new questions as we go forward. Maybe I'm too simplistic in my thinking. So with that, I'll bring Jens to the table because Jens is going to talk about the solutions at the very other end of the spectrum. What if we've done all this work? We've got 50% of the situation nailed. We've still got 50% of our emissions to go. And for some of those deep industrial problems like cement, and making aluminum, making steel, they're all dependent on processes to this date that we can reduce their emissions, but we have not got mechanisms to eliminate their emissions. How do you develop technologies that are negative emission technologies? Well, guess what? We don't. We've had trees for millennia. They work really well. They've been road tested, and we have them. So Jens is going to tell you what you can do with them. Jens.
Thank you, Andy. And you will set my...
Yep, you'll be right up.
Thanks. Thanks, Andy, and thanks to everyone organizing this event. Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Minister Heyman, and really appreciate when government joins us to raise awareness about the scope and scale of the challenge. And I will try to share both hope and information. I think as a forest and climate campaigner working for Sierra Club BC, I also have to talk a bit about climate reality and make sure that we are not staying in denial about the scope and scale of this challenge. But it's my pleasure to talk about forests, and forests give me hope because as you already know, we have to change everything to fight climate change, but in the case of our forests and forest management, we can not only reduce emissions, we can also make sure that our forests are or become a carbon sink again. And they, as Andy already mentioned, they're in fact the only important known mechanism that really works well to sequester carbon at this point in time. So I will talk a bit about forests and climate change. That means that I will also take a look a little bit at just how big this challenge is. And it is very scary. So it is maybe the scariest thing is that it's us. It's this moment in time. There will be no generations after us that have the ability to slow down climate change. There's a big risk of runaway climate change, and we have to take dramatic action now, not tomorrow. And that's a big challenge. It's also scary, but it's important to deal with this. And in case I'm not doing a great job sharing hope tonight, I will recommend this article by Rebecca Solnit, The Future Hasn't Already Been Decided. And that's really important too. When we look at the climate science, at the trajectory, it looks very dire. And we have to remind ourselves that we still have control, and we have the technology. Now we need the will as individuals and your political will to take action and move forward with the scope and scale that is needed. Before I talk about carbon stored in forests, I also have to remind us that forests are incredibly important for biodiversity and for livelihoods. So by far most of the known species known in terrestrial ecosystems exist in forests, and hundreds of millions of people globally depend on intact forests. They also regulate the climate, but this is really important, and I want to make sure that we reflect about this too. So these, I think, are the three most important things we have to consider when we talk about forests and climate. So number one, they are already helping us to slow down climate change by absorbing a lot of carbon. Secondly, they can make the problem worse. They store a lot of carbon, and if we do not slow down climate change, a lot of carbon will be released because of fire, because of insects, because of die-off. And the total of carbon storage in the world's forests is about 340 gigatons of carbon. That's about 34 times our annual emissions currently, and that can become a problem unless we take action in a timely manner. And it's clear that any plan to stabilize the climate at this point in time will require forests. So I would like to briefly summarize a few quick things about the IPCC report. So maybe the three most important things. Number one, 1.5 degrees will be severe. There will be very negative impacts, but 2 degrees will be significantly worse. So there's a lot of science now that shows that we should not test 2 degrees. We really should try to slow warming and keep warming below 1.5. Secondly, on the current trajectory, we will be at 1.5 around 2040. That's only 22 years away, and we really have to avoid being at 1.5 around 2040. And what this means is moving as quickly as possible to zero emissions. It also means zero emissions around 2050. It means about halfway there by 2030. And this is one example where it shows that if we want to be safe, if we want to be relatively safe, we better do this quickly. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it will be. And one of the positive things about the IPCC report is that there's so much detail now that shows pretty much exactly what we have to do. Yes, there's a lot of serious science, but it also includes a lot of scenarios, pathways that leave little doubt about what exactly we have to do. So excuses about, we need more research, doesn't really cut it at this point. So these are just two examples of pathways, of scenarios that show how we have to reduce emissions quickly, and then there are some scenarios where we allow a little bit more time to meet zero emissions, and then we get to negative emissions. So you can see two examples of negative emissions here. One is the agriculture, forestry, and other land use, where we essentially use forests and change land use to make sure that we sequester more carbon from the atmosphere. And then there's bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. And that's more controversial and more problematic because it would compete with food production, with protection of ecosystems and other important issues. So it's very risky to bet on negative emissions. So we can do a lot with forests. That's a known mechanism, and there will be many benefits, but there are also problematic options that might not work. So again, it's really important to move on and quickly reduce emissions from burning fossil fuels. It also means that many countries around the world actually have to adjust their targets, including Canada and our province. Our current targets are not consistent with what the IPCC report shows what is needed. It also means that there's no room to build new fossil fuel projects. That's very clear. There are no exceptions for any fossil fuel. It's about coal, it's about oil, and it's about gas. And there's no footnote for giving exceptions for some countries or others. Again, forests are already helping us to sequester carbon, to reduce emissions. Currently, about half of the world's emissions are absorbed by oceans and forests and other vegetation, and it's about a quarter each, about a quarter for the oceans, a quarter on land, and hopefully this will continue, but there's a risk. If we don't stop climate change, we are losing the forests. And we are already seeing examples with the forest fires. So the forest fires in BC are scary. I'm sorry, I cannot change this fact, but 2017 and 2018 were 8 times above the 10-year average, and both years essentially quadrupled our official provincial emissions. And this could be a sign of a feedback that could persist, and it's another wake-up call, a warning signal that we have to move faster reducing emissions from fossil fuels, because we have this risk of losing our forests. We already lost a lot of forests globally over thousands of years. That's pretty much a reduction from about 50% of the land covered by forests to now 30%, and an estimated 120 billion tons of carbon lost over thousands of years. And here in Canada, we don't have a deforestation problem. In Canada and other parts of the world, we have a big degradation problem too. So this is one of the most detailed studies ever done on forest loss, looking at a 12-year period, 2000 to 2012. We lost about 150 million hectares as a result of deforestation, and then there were another 100 million hectares of degradation. We lost about 8% of the forests were impacted by degradation. And in 2013, when this research came out, Canada was the leading country in degradation, contributing 21% to overall forest degradation globally. And this must change if we want to do our part to help solve the climate crisis. This is a quick look at the situation in British Columbia with 20-year period, 1993 to 2002 on the left, and the following 10 years on the right. The first half of the graph shows when our forests were still a sink. They were still absorbing carbon, and then you can see the black line going over zero. And that's a result of the mountain pine beetle, but it's also a result of harvest. So you can see here is that we have emissions related to logging in blue, and we could reduce those emissions because we have a lot of control over logging, and we have destructive logging practices that we can change. So the green is the part where we sequester carbon, and we see the impact of the mountain pine beetle because there were more dead trees, reducing the ability of our forests to sequester carbon. But we can also see that the blue bars are really significant, and that's where we have still a lot of control, and that's where we have an opportunity to reduce emissions, producing timber in a way that causes less carbon emissions. And we have a globally unique opportunity to do this because we have forests that store more carbon than other forests around the world. So we have very high carbon storage per hectare in our ancient rainforests. We have among the tallest trees globally. And we have now more science showing that old trees continue to sequester carbon. Old growth forests are a carbon sink. Older trees accumulate more carbon than young trees. So one example of research showed that trees absorb about 70% of their total carbon in the second half of their lifetime. So if we cut down trees in 50 years, 60 years, we are losing a lot of this mechanism by cutting trees at a young age. And on average, old growth forests in the temperate climate zone continue to sequester about 2 tons per hectare. So there are a lot of healthy trees in an old-growth forest that continue to sequester carbon, and the carbon remains stored in resilient ecosystems. There are many other options how we can enhance the ability of our forests to sequester carbon. We can increase forest area, we can increase site level carbon density. There are a lot of forestry improved management options, but the timing is really relevant too if we look at different options. And when we protect existing forests, avoiding immediate carbon emissions from destructive logging, that has an immediate benefit. Planting trees takes time until the trees become big enough to sequester significant amounts of carbon. With the climate crisis, we have very little time, so we have to take a close look and make sure that we protect some of the richest, most productive forests and keep the carbon in the forest, just like we have to keep a lot of the carbon in the ground when it comes to fossil fuel reserves. And fortunately, we have a great example in British Columbia of the Great Bear Rainforest. So just taking a closer look here at the situation along the coasts with our coastal temperate rainforests, and we have relatively intact ecosystems in the north and central coast and Haida Gwaii, north and central coast with the Great Bear Rainforest agreements, also a science-based conservation model to ensure that we maintain ecological integrity. But in the southern portion of the BC coast, we have very high ecological risk because there's so little left. And that's why we have so much red here. That's less than 30% remaining old growth, in some cases less than 10 or even 5% by ecosystem. And we can use science, we can continue to use science like in the Great Bear Rainforest. It's not a copy and paste approach, but we can use some of these mechanisms, some of these lessons learned to protect more old growth forests in the southern part of the coast. Here's a wonderful example of how many, not all, but many intact parts of the Great Bear Rainforest look like. And this is a shocking example on southern Vancouver Island from 2015, and we have still new clear cuts in old growth on Vancouver Island. Ballpark is about 10,000 hectares of old growth logging per year on Vancouver Island. That's about 2 soccer fields per hour. 1 hectare means approximately 300 tons of carbon lost. So a ballpark estimate means that we are losing several millions of tons of carbon dioxide only from old growth logging on Vancouver Island. And we need more research to get the exact numbers, but this is not happening right now. So I really hope that Minister Heyman can help us to make it happen. And this is a reminder about the promise in the election platform. It was a very good promise to use the evidence-based scientific approach and use the ecosystem-based management of the Great Bear Rainforest as a model to modernize land use planning, working with First Nations and communities, and we really hope that the BC government will follow through on this. So, in closing, this is one of my favorite facts about how forests and plants help us to regulate the climate. I found in a book from Tim Flannery where he highlighted that overall about 8% of the carbon in the atmosphere moves through the world's ecosystems every year. If forests and plants would only absorb carbon, not release carbon, in 12 years, they would remove all the carbon from the atmosphere that exists. So obviously, plants are also releasing carbon, but it shows the great potential. If we change forests differently, if we get our act together and change how we manage the land and protect ecosystems, we have a great opportunity here. Importantly, we have to reduce emissions from fossil fuels very quickly because, as Bill McKibben pointed out, winning slowly is the same as losing. It has to happen very quickly because otherwise we will pass these dangerous thresholds we will lose more forests as a result of fire, of insects, of other climate impacts. So we must not allow this. And really my last slide, since I'm from Germany, nobody expected that the Berlin Wall would come down in November 1989. In fact, the last leader of East Germany, Erich Honecker, stated in September 1989 that the wall will stand in 50, even 100 years. It took another 6 weeks. And I think this is a powerful reminder that it's up to us, because the technologies exist, and it's now depending on us as individuals and our governments to do this. Although it's scary and difficult, but it's technically possible, so the alternative is unthinkable. Thank you.
Okay, so top of the pile here is a question. We've got 30 votes for this question. And is, what is the provincial government's plan to meet our legislated mid-century GHG emissions target, considering the recently approved LNG projects? I figure you probably guessed that one was coming earlier. Was that be right, George?
Well, thank you. As I said, you won't have to wait more than about 4 or 5 weeks to see at least the phase that takes us to 2030, and we set benchmarks to move along 2030, 2040, 2050. It will also have accountability mechanisms built in it, and the modeling does include that recent decision to build that project.
This is anybody else want to comment? No? Okay.
Well,
so I'm going to. So there's a question here that.
Andy,
Oops, sorry. No kidding. Go for it. Then.
Okay, then. My question is: will there be a cap on how much emissions can be added by LNG in this plan? So to make sure that that increase must be limited.
So it's difficult because you're asking me to reveal a plan that we're not revealing yet, but what we have said all along is that the conditions for any LNG development would be that they would have to fit within our legislated greenhouse gas emission targets. So that's another way of saying it. I think in addition, you're going to see some legislation next week on new environmental assessment legislation that that will also contain references to impacts on legislated GHG targets.
So this next question, thank you guys. So this next question is interesting, or I find it interesting, because the notion of virtual water flows has come up in a completely different environment or workflow that I've been involved with. And I've always wrestled with this kind of notion of, is it false accounting? And so I use that as the intro to this question that I found very interesting. It was an anonymous question here, and it says, why does BC not include GHG emissions coming from incoming imported goods and marine transportation in its total carbon balance? And I'm going to riff off that because we often see the debate of LNG emissions. We often account for the production that happens here, plus the amount that then gets shipped overseas. So I don't want to fight over that little question. The question I would like to pass, with the anonymous question asker's permission, is it appropriate to double account where if we produce, let's say, 10 tons of gas, but it's burnt in Malaysia, do we count it on our books or is it counted on Malaysia's books? Because we can't account for it twice in the total carbon budget. So I've put that to you first, Jens, because I know this is a passionate topic for you. Where does it account? Where should the accounting lie? And then I'll ask George, and maybe Tim's got a thought on that. Maybe not. He's giving me the evil eye. I don't think Tim's going to take that one.
So the short answer is that our official reports must follow international agreements, and that means that no, we cannot allow double counting. But there's no reason why the provincial or the federal government would not, in addition to developing reports addressing international agreements, following international guidelines, produce additional reports that are showing very important information for us. They would not be linked to international requirements, but I think there should be 3 other reports, in fact, in addition to the official one. One on forest emissions. Forest emissions are not counted, only emissions from deforestation, but not from forest degradation. So that's a big problem, because by not including them in the official report, there's very little awareness, very little discussion about what we should do about them. So there should be a forest and land use emissions report. I think we should also have a report taking a close look at the emissions from exported fossil fuels, so oil, coal and gas export from British Columbia. That would not be double counting. It would inform decision makers to make sure that we are also following the science, which says that we have to set aside a large amount of our fossil fuel reserves as unburnable carbon. So we don't want to be too dependent on exporting fossil fuels, and we should have annual information about how much are we exporting and how much will those fossil fuels that we are exporting add to our emissions. And then thirdly, the complex problem of the emissions related to our consumption from goods that are imported from other countries. All our smartphones and many other products, we could try to do the same as an educational step to remind citizens in British Columbia and Canada and other Western countries, well, actually, there are another several tons of emissions related to the goods you buy, and maybe it helps to think twice about whether you really need the next iPhone.
So, just to Andy, to your first point, the emissions are basically counted in the by international standards in the nation in which they're emitted. So emissions that are associated with the extraction or production of any commodity or good in British Columbia would be counted here. If there's further emissions from their use, they're counted where they're used. I think Jens makes a good point, but what would be, I think in British Columbia people want to know what we're doing. I think globally we need to know what we're doing collectively. So while it would have value for British Columbia to account for that, it would have even more value for an international agreement to account for that collectively, because, frankly, the atmosphere doesn't really care where the emissions come from. They just happen. I think further to what Jens said, there's a number of things that could be done in terms of making people aware of the carbon footprint of whatever they consume, use, etc. And maybe at some point we'll get to labeling. I think from my perspective in British Columbia, the first thing we want to do is deal with the legislative framework around first setting targets, then how we apply them to decisions we make in environmental assessment or permitting, and then have a strategy to reduce our emissions internally, and then work on a range of other measures to both be accountable for what we're doing internally and report publicly in a verified way to people about what we're doing, and then have education programs, preferably ones that are agreed to internationally, but not necessarily. It would be just a great start to do it in BC and then across the country to help guide people about choices.
Thank you. So this one is coming your way, Tim. Vancouver has a large fleet of zero-emission electric buses, and are there plans to expand that network? And I listen to the news and hear, all the debate over SkyTrain or LRT out in Surrey. And it always, and China has just put their 100,000 fully electric bus on the road in China. It's one of those 100,000, just think about that, 100,000 electric buses. Why to me, it seems a very straightforward solution. What would your thought? And instead of having SkyTrain at $3 billion, you buy a lot of buses, I suspect, for $3 billion. What's your thoughts on those perhaps more tangible, immediate, I can go shopping tomorrow solutions?
Maybe to answer the last question first, which is kind of, couldn't you just buy a whole bunch of electric buses and it would be a lot cheaper than doing a Broadway subway? It won't move the number of people we want to move. I appreciate everyone here is, a lot of you are sort of stopping climate change is your sort of number one priority, and that's fantastic. There is also the question of like moving enough people around the city so they're not stuck in congestion. The 99B line that runs along Broadway, those buses are running as frequently as they possibly can already. They're articulated buses. I sometimes land up catching it if I miss the SkyTrain sometimes. So you can wait kind of 3 or 4 buses worth at commercial Broadway when they're loading from empty. So a higher order transit mode is needed. However, buses are definitely the answer in a lot of other parts of the city. The question is right. So the trolley buses are fully electric. So that's great. They are a right pain in terms of if you want to divert one due to special events or you want to kind of alter its route, you're looking at like $250,000 just to kind of put a switch in so it can sort of turn left if there isn't one already or something like that. And we're having to do a lot of that work just for the diversion of existing routes for the Broadway subway, just during the construction period, right? Diverting the 17 or something so it doesn't actually run along Broadway. Take a breath. So TransLink, so I work for the City of Vancouver. TransLink is obviously a separate organization, but TransLink has recently come out with a kind of a low carbon fuel strategy. I think it's public. It's public, yeah. And so I think they have targets by 2050 to be kind of zero emission. And I think the cost of these fully battery electric buses as opposed to the trolley buses, they are coming down now. And I think kind of someone's calculated that kind of probably something similar to one of you guys said earlier on, maybe it was you, George, like we're not far away from the point where they do make kind of financial sense to buy as well, which is aligned with when TransLink need to purchase a lot of these things anyway to replace aging fleets. So we will see some of that. TransLink is experimenting with some battery electric buses, thanks, that they've got from a couple of different companies for the Route 100, which is on Marine Drive. They'll be coming next year. So they're kind of, but that is just a few, admittedly. But yeah, so we're getting there.
So, well, thank you, because you just reminded me, because your graph, one of your PowerPoints showed that the density of people moved per kilometre per minute or per hour, I forgot, SkyTrain is right off the charts at the bottom, and that is the trick, is that it's very easy for the layperson like me to think, oh, just go buy a bunch of electric buses. But if you could sort of put it together in some metric, which was, kilograms of carbon dioxide emitted per kilometre per dollar per minute, where the minute is what we really value in our lives, in the here and now, that's where the city's policy is kind of trying to optimize and find a sweet spot in that space, which means the Andy Wright, dumb person's response of buying a lot of electric buses doesn't actually help.
Well, I think this and I kind of just assuming this, the sort of the CO2 emissions per person or the GHG emissions per person related to the kind of space per person is probably like highly correlated. So it's way more efficient to stick 60 people even on a diesel bus than it is to have 60 people all driving their own vehicle.
For sure.
So.
But if we go from 60 people to 600 people in the same time and same distance on SkyTrain, it's even better again. Right. Yeah.
I'll just be very quick. I think the real lesson, and I was pleased to see Tim fill in. I don't know why I focus so much on zero-emission personal use vehicles and not as much on transit, when I spend a significant amount of time urging more transit to be built when I was first elected. But the point is that different modes of transportation are most effective for different uses. In BC, we have TransLink and Metro Vancouver, and BC Transit in the rest of the province. Things like SkyTrain will not be effective in the rest of the province, but electric buses will.
So that brings us to my own question that I pushed into the poll. I'm pleased to see that 26 people have voted for me, so thank you. So you're not 26, but it was my first question I placed early today to kick this thing off. What steps is the government taking to encourage electric cars in BC? Dealers seem to reluctant to carry stock, and could we have an EV mandate for the car dealerships to sell cars or make them available?
Of course we can, and when we, as we're developing the Clean Growth Climate Strategy, we put out some intentions papers with a whole bunch of suggestions, which were strong hints that that's what we were thinking about. And clean energy. I don't want to say just electric, because that's not the only form of clean energy vehicle. Will mandates by certain dates of a percentage of new vehicle sales to be clean energy help? Is that useful? And the answer is, of course it will be, and other jurisdictions have done that, are doing that, and stay tuned.
Tim.
So on the city side, and it's not just Vancouver, but a lot of municipalities now are kind of mandating a very high percentage of parking in new multifamily units be like pre-wired for electric charging, which I think is just sort of a bylaw change, so that's very easy. And I also know at Vancouver we're doing a lot to promote like kind of public electric charging stations as well. That's in our sustainability department, not our transportation department. So I don't know the details of that, but that's another important one. I'd also say electric bikes, electric assist bikes. Yeah, I think that's got a big role to play. Like, I live in Port Moody. There's a lot of people who drive down off Heritage Mountain and then do the park and ride and then get on SkyTrain or West Coast Express. That's a big hill. I understand people don't want to cycle up that. I wouldn't want to cycle up it either. I don't live up it. I chose to live near the station, but that's fine. But people ask me, like, what's the silver bullet for sort of solving sustainable transportation? I always say there isn't one, but if you forced me to pick one, I might say electric assist bikes. I know there's like government incentives for electric vehicles. Like, personally, not speaking for the city of Vancouver, but personally I would love to see an incentive for electric assist bikes as well. Like, I think that could be a real game changer in some more sort of suburban areas. Yeah. Oh wow, it's popular. It's good.
Yeah. No, I actually think that's really important, because why I'm a big fan of the program, the incentive program to help people buy electric cars, is usually the more wealthy people in the province that currently can afford an electric car. And speaking as one of those people, I'm more than happy to pay full price. I'd rather see the program, a hint to George here perhaps, shift to help people who could only afford an electric bike move that way, so sort of more of a downwardly, mobile pressure. I think would be very important. Well, we're at 9 o'clock, folks, which is our deemed line in the sand. Is there anybody in the question with an absolute burning question that they'd like to ask? And before young man in the front row.
So,
let me grab my microphone.
Sorry. There we go. Okay, good. This one goes to you, George. So all the policies and legislation going in, or that will be going in, are hugely important, and we really need them. But my question is, how do we ensure that they aren't changed in the future or repealed or overwritten or by another government that may come in? Thank you.
There's two ways you can do it. One is you can legislate accountability and reporting mechanisms, but legislation can be ripped up and changed, and effectively there is no way you can stop another government from coming in and pretty much undoing anything a previous government did. But there is one way that will help. I'm going to talk about the way to help with that in a minute. The other thing that we can do is we can build the kind of popular support and the momentum for the changes that we want to introduce and the accountability mechanisms that we want to introduce, so that we won't end up in a situation like we ended up with in Ontario, where The programs were not understood, poorly communicated, unpopular, and easily ripped up by the Doug Ford government. So the other thing we can do to help keep governments from ripping up is vote yes for proportional representation. And tell your friends.
So on that note, I'm going to thank our three speakers and ask you to join me while I'm giving them a small thank you for joining us tonight. Oh, sorry guys, before you leave. Before you leave. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. If you would like to engage with us, if you can remember, catchafallingsky@gmail.com. We would really like to hear your feedback on tonight and put your name on a mailing list. Anything you can think about tonight that will help us polish and inform the next meeting that we'll have in February, that would be very much appreciated. Thank you.